It's always good to start a tutorial with a cheesy line, so for this one, let's try this. Remember the 11th of November, or really, the last 30 minutes of the 11th of November. We need to rush to get this shit done. We're on day 11 of Nodevember, and today we are doing prehistoric, so I thought, why not make a meteor? Because, you know, the meteor killed the dinosaurs, allegedly. I mean, I don't know if it's, like, being argued or not. I think we're all in agreement that that happened. But I guess that's prehistoric, even though we do somehow have a history of it. Whatever. If you think about it too hard, it's going to hurt your brain. A couple days ago, I did one of these Nodevember tutorials pretty much off the cuff. So again, I haven't made a meteor here. The render you saw at least a couple seconds ago is what we are going to be making right now. And people seem to like that off the cuff kind of style without me knowing what I'm doing, because maybe they like seeing me confused. So that's what we're going to be doing. We're going to take the light, we're going to get rid of it. Render settings, we're going to switch over to cycles again because of displacement. This is the key idea behind cycles. Not only does it look better, you know, Eevee's actual garbage sometimes, although it does render fast. It does allow us to do displacement. So with our cube, we already have a material applied. Settings, make sure this is set to displacement only. And I guess the drawback, by the way, I know I'm all over the place, but that's the point. The drawback of doing these tutorials live is I don't know what the fuck I'm doing, right? We're doing this shit on the fly. Basically, what I'm trying to do right here is set up the scene for the meteor before we do any of that vector displacement, whatever. So what I'm trying to do is load in an HDRI so we have better lighting than like a point light. HDRI is one that I have from HDRI Haven. I guess we'll use one with like a sun, even though I guess this thing's supposed to be in outer space, whatever. I guess technically we should have a black background and a single point light, but you ever heard of stylized? Me neither. Okay, let's save this thing. I'm going to call it something creative like I have a... You probably think I'm going to say Patreon. No, I'm going to say Pat-R with two R's on. So I have a Patreon. Completely different. It's not the same thing. Okay, we have this set up. Subdivision, so I'm hitting Control 3, just had 3 layers of subdivision set to simple so we don't cheat. And long story short, this whole ramble has led us to where to a setup scene that is now prepared. So now we can actually make our meteor. Now what I'm thinking is I want to take this cube, make it a sphere, kind of stretch it out into an ellipsoid, and then just, you know, stack a bunch of displacements until, or not displacements, I guess a bunch of noises until this is displaced correctly. So I guess let's go with that plan, see if it works well. With vector displacement, if you haven't watched these tutorials before, which, welcome, this is probably the best choice you've made. Well, not really. It's an okay decision. If you haven't seen these before, whenever we do vector displacement, it's good to use generated coordinates because this is the only coordinate system, unlike the rest of these, other than UV, I guess. But forget about that. That's nonsense. Generated is the only coordinate system that comes along for the ride with displacement. So the idea is you take generated coordinates and you try to mimic the look of object coordinates, again, using this so that we have all the niceties, all the things that are nice about object coordinates while actually having them from generated coordinates. Okay, what in the effer am I talking about? What I've done here is I've taken generated coordinates, I've shifted them by vector and scaled them by 2, which, long story short, gives us something that looks a lot like object coordinates. In fact, if we look at object coordinates and distinguish them between these are now indistinguishable. The reason is we took generated coordinates, the origin's in the bottom left corner because it's a bounding box, so we shifted it to the middle, and then we scaled by 2 so that the interval goes from 0 to 1 on every axis, and yeah, it does exactly that. So point is, take this, make it a node group, and I'm going to call this our coordinates because it is exactly that. Okay? So this is our start. I'm going to duplicate it over, and now name of the game is, first of all, making it a sphere, then stretching it, etc. So the trick to making this a sphere that I've talked about a million times, vector math, take it, connect it, and set this to normalize. And the reason this works is if we take all these vectors that make up the, you know, texture coordinates of this cube, so these are essentially object coordinates made with generated coordinates. If we take these and normalize them, they are all going to have the same length. In other words, they are going to be equidistant from the center, which is exactly what a sphere is, okay? If we take this and connect it to displacement, it kind of gives us a, you know, you've seen Harry Potter 3. They ate too much food. Not the grandparents, the uncles? Who were the Dursleys? More like the Nerdleys. Either way, they got fat, right? This is kind of what we want, but again, displacement should be a displacement. It should be a change in coordinates, not including these initial, you know, coordinates. Long story short, it looks bad. Wow. I guess the long story short isn't the way to say it, but what I was trying to say, long story short, this isn't looking correct because it's including our initial coordinate system, and we just want the change. So in other words, take this, subtract away, so we're subtracting a vector, the very same coordinate system, and it gives us a sphere. So again, we've ingrained the instructions to turn this cube into a sphere, but then said take away the original coordinates since that is not part of the transformation, okay? So we're gonna take this node, give it a color like, I don't know, red, blue, yellow. I feel like I don't mess with yellow, green. The reason we're doing that is whatever vector displacement stuff we're doing here, we're just going to add more stuff to this chain. At the very end of it, we should always be subtracting away our original coordinate system, since again, we want the transformation, okay? So what do we have so far? We have a setup that gives us a sphere out of a cube. Let's make that shade smooth so it's looking smoother. And then additionally, we could have a bit more geometry. And in fact, I guess it's probably a good time to change this to experimental. So that we could do adaptive subdivision, so it's going to be subdividing based on the dicing scale. In other words, we don't say, wow, you know, there's nothing more pathetic than not only saying the words wrong, but then your voice cracking in a tutorial makes me, oh, it just happened again. It makes me want to die. I feel like a prepubescent kid just trying to get a point across, and it's so hard. Point is, subdivision is going to be based on a dicing scale, not on the number of divisions. Okay. Now we have a sphere. How do we take this and stretch it out? Hopefully, I'm trying to do that big man deep voice so it doesn't happen again. We're going to multiply by 1, 1, 1 so nothing happens. And then if we take x-axis and make it bigger, you're going to see when we look at it this way, it gives us a ellipsoid again because we have a sphere and we're saying multiply the x-axis. In other words, stretch it by, let's say, 2 or something like that. So this is going to be the base shape for our meteor. Now, what is it that makes things look like rocks and meteors and all that? It is that random, jagged nonsense that we need. And by the way, am I using optics? I think I changed out of it. Optics for that fast render. By the way, the reason I wasn't in optics is later on we're going to be using ambient occlusion, I think, at least in theory, it's a good idea. Doesn't work with optics, so I switched out of it. But for now, we can keep optics. Just means my graphics card's going to use all those muscles that, you know, worked on in the gym. It's not going to use those little pathetic triceps. It's all biceps, baby. Okay, sphere, we've stretched it. Next step, how do we add in noise? Very simple. I'm going to use a noise texture, not a white noise, but a noise texture. You could use Musgrave, you could use whatever you want. You could use your mom, ha, ha, ha. Okay, either way, take this, take your noise, we're going to mix them together, and then to not have this shift up by the vector, 0.5, 0.5, 0.5. Again, this happens because on average, noise adds 0.5 on the X, Y, and Z axes. To correct for this, whenever you mix something together, like a coordinate system with a noise, always make sure to use linear light. And then second of all, make sure that the noise texture is using the updated coordinate system. So right now it's kind of using generated coordinates. I mean, it's not in here, but that's what it's assuming. So if we were to add in texture coordinates, make them generated, there shouldn't be much of a difference. But if we connect this, now we have a much more even noise. And the nice thing about this, once we set it to color, the nice thing about this is we can control the effect of this noise. So when this is set to 0, it's not going to have much. And then we could kind of bump it up so it has a bit of, distortion going on. And what I'm thinking is we do kind of like low frequency, high frequency kind of stuff. So in other words, big changes and then tiny changes on top of that. So first of all, let me add more geometry. And for the big changes, we could do that by making the scale much smaller. So it's lower frequency detail, not like all the spiky stuff. We can now make it bigger, so it's kind of doing more deformation. And I'm thinking even lower frequency, like 0.5. And this just gives us a kind of random situation that we can make more or less intense, something like this. I guess we could play around with the noise a bit more. I think the lower the detail, maybe the better for this thing. But I do want some jagged edges, but we don't want to go too high with this. Maybe something like 3 or 4, just to get the basic form. And I think roughness is what's going to really mess this up. Okay, so let's not do roughness. Okay, so far, what do we have? We have a sphere, we stretched it, we added noise, and now let's add high frequency detail, or we could actually add in pores before we do that. I guess order of operations do matter a bit, so let's add some like more defined pore detail before we just add a bunch of noise everywhere and say, fuck it, I'm throwing the dice, let whatever happens, right? So I guess let's start with a Voronoi, and I'll show you how to make pores out of this. At least hopefully I can figure it out. I think I should be able to. Again, whenever you're using a noise, anything that uses the texture coordinates, we're going to use the most updated thing down this chain. So again, sphere, stretch, noise. So this is now the newest thing. Take this, connect it, and now we have a Voronoi texture like this. By the way, if we didn't have this, it would be very stretched out, okay? So that's why we do it. So to get pores, I think the first step is, first of all, getting circles that we can then turn that radial pattern into pores. So I'm going to subtract, I'm going to invert, and this kind of gives us a nice radius slider because we are subtracting, comparing to this distance. And, you know, there's this whole explanation for what the fuck Voronoi is. I'm not going to be the one to explain it to you. In the words of a very wise teacher, go ask your parents, okay? Let's just clamp it just in case weird stuff happens. And the nice thing about this, completely procedural. We can decide the number of dots. So I'm thinking something like this. Each one of these, which again, we can change with like randomness and stuff like that so they're not overlapping as much. Each of these is going to be a pore. Now again, the question is, how do we do that? This displacement that we want to be kind of like these craters in the meteor, which I guess that's a thing, right? Am I thinking of an asteroid? Whatever. To do this, what we need is displacement along the normal. In other words, not like vector displacement, although we can incorporate this with vector displacement. Displacement going inside the shape, and that's, you know, the standard displacement node that we don't see much of anymore. So we take this, we're going to connect this as the height, and let's see what that gives us. Gives us this nice displacement map, and then because vector displacement and displacement are essentially, it's confusing, but they're essentially the same thing. Displacement is essentially vector displacement along the normal direction. Because they're essentially the same thing, what we could do is add in a vector math node, set this one to add, and we can add these two ideas together, and then we have our vector displacement from before with our additional displacement. Okay, why does this look like a, I mean, there's really no other way to put it. Why does this look like a spiky sex toy, right? How do we solve this? First of all, take your mid-level, set it to 0, just so it doesn't do any weird stuff. So here is before, and here is after. So you can see these spikes are coming out in the, you know, the shape of our circles, and they are coming out along the normal, so outwards. Of course, we want it inwards, but generally it's the right thing. We take this, we invert it, so instead of like a positive number, like -1, and then it kind of caves inwards. And then I guess to make this look better, it shouldn't just be like bowls cutting into this, but it should have a bit of a lip and stuff like that. I guess we're going to need a bit more geometry for this, and this is where it starts getting laggy, but whatever. To give this a lip, I guess what we could do is before we before we very explicitly, with a lot of anger and confidence, put this in the displacement node, right, the height, we want to mess with our height map just a bit. So again, we have these radial maps that start at 1 or something close to 1 on the inside, and then they fade off as they go outwards. We want to manipulate that, I guess, with Rgb curves, so we can make a custom shape. Rgb curves, you know, if you're not in the know, if you haven't been told by a friend or whatever, Rgb curves are kind of like the de facto, I don't know what that means. It's the go-to way to make custom shapes because you can actually like draw it out and see how it's affecting these pores in different ways. What I'm thinking is when we are at 0, well, to be honest, I don't really know. I think we're just going to make a lip like this. Yes, that's kind of doing it. I think the idea behind what we want to do here is have it start off higher and then go lower. This is what makes it, you know, kind of go outwards before it goes inwards, but I'm thinking we overdid it a little. So something like this, and we can play around with it live. We do this, and then we go back up, something like that. So that's kind of like the thing we want. These are kind of like pores. I think the theory behind this, and we could play around with the shape to make it look better, and in fact we will. The theory behind this is, again, remember we have negative displacement, so whatever you think you see, you know, kind of flip it in your head. First of all, we took this and made it very high, so it's displacing outwards or something like that, and then we curve back in. To be honest, I don't know. You give it kind of a lip shape, it's going to make a lip. We can think about it all day. It makes more sense when these numbers are positive, but long story short, we can make a very tight lip, something like that where it's very thin, but I'm thinking we want kind of like a smooth kind of transition, so I'm going to lower that a bit, maybe lower this a bit even. We don't want these to be ridiculous. I think this is a good start. And again, this is going to do it for every radial map. So again, we had these circles, we did the Rgb curves, it's displacing, etc. To make it look better, we could play with the number of these. So we could have many of these on the surface, maybe like 3 would be a better way to do it. And also, again, this is, you know, all the, you already know this, but all the shit's procedural. So at any time, you could add in like some W slider to change where these pores are going to be, etc. For now, we're not going to mess with that, but I'm thinking, should these be a bit deeper or shallower? Like if I make it -1, it will be deeper. Does that make it look more like cheese? I think it does. We don't want it to be that intense. Negative 0.4, just so it's slightly less intense. That's a good start. I'm thinking for now we'll keep it. We can mess around with it a bit more. So again, I always like to go back over the vector displacement network as if you're an idiot, who didn't pay attention. I know you did, but this is really for my own amusement. We took a coordinate system that was based off generated coordinates to mimic object. Wow, that was the worst voice crack yet. Wow, I feel really bad about that one. Kind of want to end it right now. We got to push through. We got to push. Maybe I could edit it out, but of course I won't. Coordinates, we normalize them to make a sphere. We stretch this out. I think I need to drink more water or talk less today to make it less intense. Either way, took that low frequency displacement for our shape to make it look more like a asteroid or a meteor. Then we added our Voronoi pores, which again, maybe there's too many of these. We could do it like, maybe we can make fewer of them, but also make them smaller. So again, this is going to control the overall size of these. So you need to make them nice and small. Maybe 2.5. Point is, we added in pores, and now, I guess what comes next is up for us to decide. I'm thinking now we do high frequency detail, which is essentially the same step as this noise texture, but we're going to change the details of this. So I guess we could take it, copy it over, mix these together. Again, whenever you do this, make sure you are using the most updated coordinate system. And also, make sure that we are setting this to linear light. So right now, this is it without any, effect, and this is it with more. We want high frequency displacement is the idea here, or high frequency detail. So for this one, full detail, maybe a bit of roughness. We'll make the scale bigger. And if we bring this up, we should start seeing, yeah, there we go. Now we're getting that high frequency detail. That's going to be a bit choppy, not only because our noise is high intensity, but because we need more geometry. Point is, I think we want a lot of roughness, a lot of detail, probably no distortion, and maybe even, larger scale, in other words, smaller details. Let's take this, bring it down even further so we can actually see what's going on. Yeah, now it's really starting to look like a rock. I'm thinking maybe this is a bit intense, or what we could do is we could have it be less intense in the pore areas, just so we get a bit more detail. Although that would kind of mess with things a little. You know what? Let's do it. Okay, so we have this map from before. I'm going to take this, I'm going to invert it. So in other words, we're saying we want this everywhere where there isn't pores. Let's see what that looks like. We want it in the color. Wow, I guess that isn't exactly it. Could we subtract to do it nicely? Okay, so we view it like this, 1 minus that. I guess that isn't the way to go. Either way, bring this down. Now you have a custom mask, and let's try to connect this as our factor, see what happens. That's the thing with doing these on the fly. It can get pretty messy. Okay, so generally you can see, other than the fact that it looks like, cottage cheese, right? Or it looks like, sticking your hand through a meat grinder or something like that. It's growing mold and stuff like that now. The fungus is spreading. Other than all those things, right? The pores seem to be preserved. So I think all we need to do is take this and then multiply it by some number that's less than 1 to make it less intense. So I'm thinking something like 0.25, so it's a quarter as strong. It's going to take a while to update. And yeah, there you go. Now we have that high frequency detail, but not where the pores are, at least less. So again, the reason this works is because we're taking these circular Voronoi things we have from before, and we're doing some filtering to them and then saying only mix the noise texture in this linear light sense wherever we've scaled these things, right? So that's kind of like, I guess that's the general kind of shape we want for this. Of course, we could always play around with this at the low frequency step to make it even crazier. Maybe make it like slightly higher detail. But this is a nice way to generate different meteors and asteroids on the fly where the pores carry over and stuff like that. Okay, so I think now we have our base geometry. Now how many licks does it take to get to the center of me finishing this sentence? How do we do this BSDF correctly? This is where I'm thinking we use ambient occlusion. And for that, if you want to use the ambient occlusion node, sadly, you got to use your CUDA cores. I know. If you have an RTX card, you're probably weeping. What I'm thinking is instead of just giving this like a color and, waiting for it to update, so I do something like this, make it pretty dark. Instead of doing it like that, we could have the color be based off how much like sharpness and cavity mapping there is at different places. So let's do that. First of all, bring up the roughness so it's not as shiny, like 0.85. For the base color, again, what I'm thinking is we use an ambient occlusion node. So let's view that ambient occlusion. We take this, we make it more intense. So again, this is saying what parts of the mesh are kind of not self-intersecting, but are very close to each other, whereas they're self-shadowing happening. We take that, we color ramp, we make it higher contrast, just so you can really see the detail. And we can already set this up as base color. You can see this already gives us a nice kind of organic rock kind of thing, because again, wherever kind of like dirt or whatever would accumulate, in other words, in all the crevices, and especially, sorry, I'm taking forever to say things in between sentences. These burps are intense. Wherever we have crevices, we have some, additional coloring, stuff like that. So what I'm thinking is we take the white color, in other words, most of the rock. Let's make that kind of like a grayish, maybe tiny bit brown, something like that, even darker. We do something like that, and then for the rest of it, do we just keep it black? Do we make it a different color? I guess you could be stylistic at this point, right? Something like that. It's already looking like an asteroid. Is it too bright? I don't know. Got to play around with this. I mean, at this point, a lot of what it looks like is actually lighting dependent. It's not really dependent on the base color. Again, this is looking yellow because our HDRI is like something of a sunset or something. We could have a different HDRI and it's going to look completely different. I think probably the first one's what we want, just because it looks kind of like it's in the sky. Yeah, kind of like the look of the first one. It's very high contrast as well. But, I guess something we could do is make it a little less intense on the color. So we do a hue saturation. Normally I don't mess with the HDRI this way. Not hair info, but hue saturation. Take this, make the saturation like 0.75. That'll make it a little less intense. Maybe a little too less intense, something like that. And I guess this is telling me that the asteroid should be even darker, or maybe even rougher, something like that. And for this one, I guess there's too much color. Just tweaking with the colors, most interesting thing in the world. Something like that is already looking pretty good. And again, this is going to look significantly better on render because we're going to get all that detail. Let me see, that all the noises, are they all using the most current setup? I think so. So now, or maybe we could even make this high frequency detail more intense. Let me just bump this up, see what that looks like. This should make it look much more rocky. Yeah, there we go. Now we're getting all that grain. That's cool. Other than this, we could add a bit of like fake detail. And at this point, I wouldn't actually recommend doing this since most of our detail is in displacement anyways. But if you wanted to add in a bit of normal mapping, what you could always do, noise texture, make it like crazy big so we have a very fine noise. Again, make sure to use the most recent step of your displacement. So you can see we have this very fine detail. What we do with it is we send this through a bump node to take height information, and convert it into normal information, which we should be able to view in a moment once it calculates, if it ever, does that. There we go. We take this, we connect it into the normal socket, we then view the BSDF, and now it should have kind of like a stupid amount of detail once it loads. I wouldn't necessarily recommend this, but this is a pretty inexpensive way just to get some extra super high frequency detail. So I'm going to take this, bring it down to like 0.5. This is looking more like a muddy rock, but to kind of amplify the meteorite kind of thing about this, which again is those pores. Let's go back down to like -1 on that displacement, and we can always make those bigger or more plentiful, like 3.25. This is just going to make more pores. Yeah, that's looking much more meteorite-y. Again, most of this is lighting and stuff like that, but can you believe that all this came from a cube and we can change it procedurally and all that? I can't. I'm barely believing it right now. But sometimes you got to believe it. So, I mean, I guess that's kind of like the setup. Some stuff you might control in a node group that you might make is, you might want control for this. So again, if we set this back down to 1, it's going to be more of a spherical asteroid, which is cool. It all works. We can mess around with how much displacement in the low frequency detail we want. Of course, you want that pretty high frequency detail Voronoi stuff, but I guess I'm going to package all that and make it available as a Patreon file. By the way, I never gave him my material name, something very memorable. I have a Patreon. I'm going to package everything that you just saw here in a nice, more presentable way, as a blend file available on the Patreon. And speaking of which, if you want access to exclusive tutorials that I do not post on either channel, the blend files of every Nodevember project, and also for the CG Matter video, stuff like that, Discord access, behind the scenes, and quite frankly, a one-way ticket to the good place, if you know what I'm talking about. Patreon is the place to go. Either way, regardless of whether or not you're interested, I want to say thank you to the all, talking's hard. I want to thank all 500 some people who are already in there. You are essentially the only reason I can make default cube and CG matter videos that don't really translate to views like Nodevember videos, but whatever. I like making them, so I'm glad that I can do that for like a whole month. But anyways, regardless of all that, thank you for watching this tutorial. Again, I'm curious if you like the off-the-cuff format versus, scripting it out a bit more. I'm a bit torn personally, but like all torn things, we gotta piece me back to, I don't know, dude. I don't know. I think that's the end of it. Sometimes the show's over when it's over, and in this case, it's over.